Good afternoon and welcome to our special council meeting of Tuesday, November 15th, 2022. I'll call the meeting to order at 5:01 p.m. First item on the agenda is Land Acknowledgement. The town of Coaldale acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot peoples of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot peoples past, present, and future, while recognizing their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The town of Coaldale is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, region number 3. Agenda item 1.2, conflict of interest declaration, pecuniary and non-pecuniary. Are there any in the room this afternoon? Thank you. Item 2.1, acceptance of the special council meeting budget agenda for November 15, 2022. Are there any additions? See none. Can I get someone to make a motion? Deputy Mayor Pickering, we adopt the special council meeting agenda for November 15, 2022. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Then we're going to move to item 8.1 under new business, budget deliberations for 2023. We have our Chief Financial Officer and Deputy CAO, Kyle Beauchamp, presenting, and this will be the first meeting of 3. Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, thanks and good evening, Council. First meeting for our 2023 budget deliberation. So kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. Part 1, kind of a budget process, goes through how we develop the budget, what those steps are, to give Council kind of an understanding of the process behind that. Following that, we're going to look at our municipal revenue and how those rates are calculated, how we compare as a town compared to the other municipalities that we generally compare to. And third point for part 1 is kind of an overview of our finances. So where our debenture debt, grants, and reserves kind of sitting at the moment. These are all items that Council has at their discretion for financing the budget. So why we're going to talk about that. That's part 1. We have part 2. We're going to fit into this meeting as well after, but we're going to go through this first. So I have a nice quick little video here we're going to play.
Have you ever wondered how our budget is developed? To many, this can seem like a complex process, so we're going to break it down and give you a basic understanding of how municipal budgeting works. Before we get started, it's important to note that communities in Alberta, like the town of Coaldale, are governed by the Municipal Government Act, which regulates how municipalities should govern and plan for growth. So, what exactly is a budget? Simply put, the town's budget is a plan of the expenditures and revenues that take place over the course of the year. Municipal governments are not permitted to budget for a deficit, so our ultimate goal is to ensure that the money coming in, or revenue, balances with the money going out, expenses. Like all municipalities, the town of Coaldale actually has 2 budgets, one for operating costs and one for capital expenditures. The operating budget covers the day-to-day services provided by the town, such as waste disposal, police and fire, parks and recreation, and cultural events, just to name a few. Out of this same budget also comes the town's financial reserves, money that is placed into savings to use for future capital expenses. Lastly, as with any household or business, the town sometimes needs loans for larger expenses that require funding over multiple years. The money to cover these payments also comes from the operating budget. The other budget, the capital budget, is used for larger, long-term investments, such as new assets or the rehabilitation of existing assets like municipal facilities or roadways and transportation networks. Each year, a draft of these 2 budgets is created by town administration to determine which services and projects need to be included. It's a bit of a balancing act to achieve this, But generally speaking, the funds are allocated based on 1. Development plans and the replacement of assets nearing the end of their life. Think outdated structures, equipment, or facilities. 2. The current council's strategic plan. 3. Desired services from the community. 4. And direct feedback from community engagement and stakeholders. Any changes to the budget are reviewed publicly with your local elected officials who approve the final budget by December of each year. Okay, so what did we learn? Let's recap. 1. Provincial legislation requires communities like the town of Coaldale to create a balanced budget every year. 2. There are 2 budgets, the operating budget, which covers the costs of day-to-day operations, and the capital budget, which covers the purchase of new assets or the rehabilitation of existing assets. 3. The town's budget is developed by staff based on a number of different factors. The budget is reviewed and approved by town council in December of each year. In the same way that you budget your household or business expenses, balancing the town budget is an ongoing process that requires ongoing monitoring. Administration reviews the actual spending against the budget plan to ensure money is being spent where it's needed and is not wasted or misallocated. The information gathered during these reviews provides valuable insight into the allocation of resources, allowing the town to provide the maximum level of service to the community while staying on budget.
Okay, so just kind of touch base on a few points from that video. So a couple years ago, the MGA came out and said that municipalities have to have a 3-year operating plan and a 5-year capital plan. So when we're looking at our budgets, operating will be from 2023 to 2025. Capital gets extended through 2027. So the rationale behind this is that some of these projects require longer term focus or a couple years to build up funding to allow us to fund the project. So if we need to borrow for something, it may take us a couple years to build up revenues or save to fund these projects. So why this long-term focus is crucial for that. So when we're looking at these budgets, we've kind of done the best forecasting of areas that might require funding or capital expenditures for the next couple years. So these will be placed in future budgets, but they're not necessarily set in stone. They're kind of think of it as a placeholder as, okay, this is coming up, we need to think about this. So items that you may see from 24 to 27, they're going to be in the budget, but they will be discussed with council again next year. So you can always go back and revisit them in the future. A summary kind of from the video. So we started in September internally reviewing budgets with departments. We go up the line on SMT when we review the budget. And then here we are in November discussing with council. And we do look for the approval in December. So if council doesn't have all the information for a budget at that time, you do have to pass an interim budget, but you can always come back and amend your budget in the new year. So the differences between the capital and operating budget. So the capital budget is largely focused on construction and acquisition of your assets. So if you were building a house, think of it as building your house. The operating budget would be how you run your house. You have to pay for your insurance, you have to pay for your utilities, and you have to pay for your maintenance. So when we're thinking of the services we provide, again, that does equal a certain standard of quality of life for a municipality. But again, that can be dictated by the level of fees, taxes, and utility rates that are charged. So kind of think of it on this graph here. When we have a certain level of service that we want to offer to the community, those do have to be kind of offset by usually added fees and taxes for increases in levels of services provided to the community. I have one more video here for you. This is just kind of walk through our revenue streams a bit.
Let's talk about how our municipal budget is funded. The town's revenue largely comes from property tax, but it's important to note that not all of the property tax you pay goes to the town. In fact, Coaldale only receives about 76% of these funds, while 23% is collected by the Government of Alberta for education, and the remaining 1% goes to the Green Acres Foundation to support our senior citizens. The town's revenue also comes from places like user fees, grants, and investment income, to name a few. The money generated from these sources is then subtracted from the budget to determine the remaining amount needed to be made up through the collection of property taxes. This is in part why year to year. To help put your property tax bill in perspective, you can compare it to the average monthly cost of other products and services that you might use, like cell phone plans, gym memberships, car insurance, or meals out. People often wonder what they get in return for paying property taxes. Well, your tax dollars help pay for things like roadways and sidewalks, facilities, and community services and programs that help meet the health, wellness, and safety needs of citizens like you. This can include things like maintenance services, infrastructure upgrades, emergency services, tax-subsidized recreation facilities and amenities, community events and services, and access to safe and enjoyable parks, playgrounds, and green spaces. Currently, the town of Coaldale's tax base sits at a 15 to 85% split between commercial and residential tax revenue. That means for every dollar of taxes collected in Coaldale, 15 cents comes from businesses versus 85 cents comes from residents. It's our goal to get these ratios closer to 20-80 split, which helps create more balance within the tax base. The town has been working hard to achieve this goal by marketing our community as a great place to do business and attract more commercial and industrial tax dollars. Okay, let's review what we've learned. Only 76% of your municipal property tax is collected by the town of Coaldale. The remaining 24% is paid to the Government of Alberta and the Green Acres Foundation. Property taxes are, on average, comparable to any other monthly bill and help pay for the services and amenities that make Coaldale a wonderful community. It's the town's goal to achieve a 20-80 split between commercial and residential property tax to maintain a healthy balance between businesses and residents. While it's important to know how your tax dollars are being put to work, it's just as important to understand how your tax bill is determined in the first place. Your town government works hard to make sure that every dollar collected is put back into making your community a remarkable place to live, work, and play.
Okay, so you've seen a couple Hollywood quality videos. We've gone through the first leg. Just pause. Any questions or good to keep going? No hands?
Keep going.
Okay, so the second part, we're going to touch base on taxes, utility rates, and franchise fees a bit. So these are kind of three of the main funding sources that council can adjust and draw from to essentially balance the budget. So first, when we talk about property taxes are based on a certain mill rate. So in this example, the mill rate is 9.51. That means for every $1,000 of assessed property, it's times by 9.51. So if your property is worth $100,000, that's 100 thousands. So you would take 100 times 9.51, which would be the property tax bill for the year. At this point, so November, December, we're looking at council to approve a budget. Coming in February and March, we will get a benchmark to complete our property assessments for all the municipalities in the town. So council does have the ability to set the mill rates, but they don't have any ability to change or adjust anything for the property assessments. That's to keep everything split. Once that's done, the tax rate bylaw is presented to the council in April and May, and then mailed out to residents for taxes due by June 30th of each year. When you're looking at residential and non-residential taxes, under the MGA, it does allow for a split of a maximum of 5 to 1. So your non-res can be up to 5 times greater your tax rate than your residential tax rate. Practically, though, we're a good goal of 1.5 to 1 would be a more feasible target for council to consider as a possible tax strategy, which we'll discuss more at a further date. So we're looking at the budget. Coaldale does have a good amount of new growth and development each year. So when there is new growth, new buildings built, new subdivisions, new businesses, that assessment is new tax revenue and new additional revenue for the town. So this year, we're projecting $210,000 in new revenue. And for the next 2 years, we've just kind of gone on some historical averages. So this could change depending on how the development in Coaldale fluctuates over the next couple of years. But you see we're close to that $200,000 a year on average. So in the context of a tax increase, based on how we're structured right now, 1% on the residential side is the equivalent of around $75,000 in additional revenue for the town, and about $8 extra per year for every $1,000 of assessed property a homeowner does have. For the non-res side, again, tax rates for non-res are a little higher, so a 1% increase in tax is a $725,000 increase in revenue, and about a $10 a year increase for every $1,000. So when we add those together, think of a 1% increase is about a $92,000, $91,000 increase in revenue for the municipality. So when we're looking at residential tax rates, these are municipalities that we have compared ourselves to through the comparative analysis or through wage analysis, through means as they're similar in size and location to the town, except Lethbridge is just on here for proximity, obviously not for the size of the municipality. So what we've done here is total tax rate in the middle. So this is the tax rate that the resident sees on their bill. This includes the municipal tax rate, the taxes they pay to the provincial government for education, and to Green Acres for seniors housing. On the right side is the one that council does have control over, increasing, reducing, changing that. That's the municipal tax rate. So that's the level of taxes that is actually used to fund the municipality. So for the purpose of this, again, Coaldale does have a $120 recreation tax levy. Some municipalities may or may not have additional special tax levies. That information is kind of difficult to find unless you really go diving in looking for it. So again, we're pointing out that Coaldale does for full transparency, but we're not quite sure if other municipalities do have anything like that as well. So when you're looking at residential tax rates, you can see Coaldale is slightly above the midway point there for residential, but overall fairly close in that middle pack. On the non-res side, again, the same basis here, total tax rate in the middle, that's what business owners do see on their tax bill. Municipal tax rate is what you as council have control over setting. Down at Coaldale does not have a machinery and equipment tax. Some municipalities do, such as Tabor does. City Lethbridge doesn't, and some of these other municipalities do have a M&E tax. Town of Coaldale does not have one. Our assessment for M&E is very low, so it would be minimal anyways. But again, in looking at these two graphs, you can see Coaldale is slightly higher compared on the res base versus the non-res base when we're looking at municipal mill rates here.
So Kyle, can you just explain a little bit further? So when we get asked on the street, what's the easy answer for residential and non-commercial? So they always say Coaldale's residential tax is higher than Lethbridge. So based on the graph that you have here now, that shows Coaldale at 10.8 and Lethbridge at 10.9. Mm-hmm. So what are those numbers? Can you explain that so we can explain to our residents on the street?
Sure. So the 10 point, so at Coaldale the 10.8. So on the right side you see the 8.06. So that is what the town actually collects for That's the portion of your property taxes that funds us.
So that's a percentage.
So that means for every, if your house is worth $1,000, you're paying, so again, mill rate is based on every $1,000 of your assessed property. So it would essentially be, you have 10,000s times 8. So it is for every $1,000 of property, you're paying $8. Again, the difference between that is just what we have to pay to Minister of Education to fund our schools and for seniors health care, for seniors living. So when residents kind of say, how's my taxes broken out? We usually like to say for every $1,000, you're paying about $8 of municipal taxes. Does that help answer that?
And I totally understand what you're saying, but for the lay person that doesn't understand the mill rate equation part of this, so would it be fair to ask you then, in a percentage, how much lower than Lethbridge are we?
We're fairly similar to Lethbridge. Our mill rate is, you can see the
Yes.
10.9 minus 10.8 is a nominal percentage. I usually say that our tax rates are slightly below Lethbridge, but that doesn't consider our recreation tax levy too. So we have lower tax rates, yes, but we do have a recreation levy. I'll touch base on that a little further, kind of in the level of services, but usually we're fairly close to Lethbridge on the residential side. If you go ahead.
And I'm just going to say, like, for the non-residential, the quick answer for people who are discussing their tax bill as business owners here, that their tax bill in Lethbridge would be twice what it would be here in Colville for the non-residential side. Like, that's more the shock factor on the non-res side.
Right, and again, for the lay person, they always like to talk in percentages, not with the mill rate equation. So with what Kaylin just said, Coldell is up like 50-some% lower than Lethbridge.
Exactly, right? So if you're looking on municipal tax rates, Lethbridge here at the top right, so that you see the 20.5, we're at 10.2. So it is 50%. Our business tax is 50% lower than Lethbridge. Our residential tax is about the same.
Okay. Thank you.
So I mentioned before tax ratios and in that 5-to-1 is the max under the MGA, but a good benchmark is kind of 1.5 to aim for. So what this graph does is, if we take our business tax rate and divide it by our residential tax rate, what does that get you? The lower this number is, it just means you have a heavier focus on your residential taxes. The higher this number is, it means you have a heavier focus on your commercial taxes. So you can see that with Coldale's residential tax rate being slightly higher than average and our non-res being slightly lower, there is, compared to our other municipalities, we do have generally a more reliance on our residential tax base than we do on our non-res. So this will go back to when we look at the mill rate and we look at setting the mill rate. What does council want to do for a tax strategy? What is a achievable number that we want to get to over the next couple of years? If 1.5 is the target, how do we get there over X amount of years? That does, again, just kind of shift some of the revenue focus from your residents to your commercial businesses. So here's some examples. If I took a couple properties here, I took a $250,000, a $350,000, and a $500,000 property, and we calculated the taxes based on the mill rates, and we added Coldale's rec levy. Again, we're not sure if other municipalities have a special levy. We've excluded it, but we've included Coldale's just for full transparency. You can see that Coldale's tax rate is lower than Blackfalds, it's lower than Tabor, it's lower than the city of Lethbridge. But when we do that at our rec levy, those residents are actually paying slightly more taxes than Blackfalds, Tabor, Lethbridge, who we do compare ourselves to. So this is just kind of information on on the pressures of our taxes on the residential base versus the non-residential base. Give you somewhat of an estimate there. When we're looking at the same thing for our businesses, they're all non-residential, you can see our tax rate again is much lower than that of the city of Lethbridge, and how much lower a business currently pays tax in Coaldale compared to, say, Tabor, Lethbridge, Blackfalds, Pinoka, Drumheller, and Edson. So kind of back to the previous point, a business that's worth $1 million in Lethbridge is paying about 25 grand in taxes. When in Coaldale, you're about 14 and change. So you can see when we keep this in mind, when we come back to developing our tax strategy, where we want to be on our residential mill rate versus our non-res, you can see that right now we have more pressure on the residential on average than we do on a non-residential tax base. So this just kind of puts this is the average, just some information for council I thought was quite relevant. This is the average property value for those compared cities and towns. So Coaldale's average property value is above average. It's only lower than Lethbridge, Morinville, and Olds. We're currently at $290,000 for an average residential property. When we compare to Tabor, who's 15, 20 minutes away, they're at $242,000 average property value. So it just kind of gives you kind of an understanding of, I could say, the breakup or the makeup for some of the communities or neighborhoods in Coaldale versus other places. When we're looking at how many residential properties we do have in town, again, we're slightly higher than other municipalities. Coaldale is currently at 3,200 properties. Tabor, just to go back to that, is about 3,100 properties. So we do have a higher number of residential properties in Coaldale, a higher average property value in Coaldale than the majority of our counterparts. When we're looking at the non-res side, so you can see we're on the higher base here for residential. When we go to non-res, we're actually a little bit more on the lower end. So Coaldale's average non-residential business is worth $724,000. So this is kind of slightly to the right of the scale compared to before. We're slightly lower than some of our counterparts. One of the telling numbers here, and one of the reasons we've had such a focus and push to develop business and through the industrial park and attract new development in Coaldale, is if you actually look at our industrial or non-residential property count, Coaldale is much more on the smaller end. We have 172 non-residential properties compared to Tabor, which has double that of 350 properties. So all this information, kind of keep this in mind when we look at we've been trying to get more of the focus for the tax pressure off our residential properties and slowly move that kind of to the non-residential base as we look at that ratio. So this is just good information, I feel, for council to kind of have in your pocket when considering and making those decisions. That is property taxes. I'm going to move on to utilities, but before that, was there any questions on property taxes from council?
Any questions for Kyle?
Okay. On municipal utilities, so we do have 4 streams, so water, sewer, waste, and storm. So these are our current municipal fees. Now, water and sewer, I do have flat charges, so those are base charges that every essentially utility bill gets charged, and some variable charges. So the more you water your grass, the more you run your taps, the more you flush your toilets, your bill will go up. So utility rates are somewhat tied to your usage. The more you use, the more you do get charged. Kind of in the highlighted top box there, just to note that the sewer flat rate is always scheduled to go up, $6.94, January 1, 2023. This was part of budget last year when we looked at the $4 million debenture loan for the sewer lagoon lift station. So as part of the capital budget, council will have additional utility rates to kind of review and consider as far as funding for future capital projects and future needs. So we've kind of taken the same basis of property taxes here in presenting the information. We wanted to take a summary of average utility rates, again, for the same municipalities, and what's an average cost per year, and what do you get for it. So again, some of these charges are variable, like the water and the sewer, so you see there's some fluctuation between the 10 cubic meters and the 20 cubic meters. Obviously, when you use more water, your bill is going to go up, so that's why you see that difference there. Coaldale is on the lower end of the scale here for average utility charges. So I'm just gonna go on the 10 cubic meters. It's about $1,200, $1,300 a year. So about $100 a year or a month on average. A resident does pay for utilities in Coaldale. If that resident gets waste pickup, curbside recycling, and compost pickup. If we compare that to, say, BYLAWS at the top, which is $500 on average more a year, they do have curbside recycling, but they don't have curbside compost. So we do have lower utility rates, and we do offer a higher level of service than some of the other municipalities. So again, BYLAWS, Innisfail, Drumheller, Edson don't have all the same waste services that Coaldale does offer. City is much lower here, largely due to economies of scale. It's cheaper to install pipe and put that cost over when you have 100,000 people compared to 9,000 in Coaldale. But again, they don't have curbside compost either. So they're currently piloting a curbside compost project. So likely those costs will go up for residents of the city, which will probably bring us even closer to that scale in the future years here. So just kind of put that data from the last slide into a graph here. So what's the average of all these municipalities, and where does Coaldale sit? So of these 10 municipalities, you'll see Coaldale is in the bottom third, below average compared to everyone else. So our utilities that residents pay, again, are below average compared to our comparable municipalities. No questions on utilities? Okay. So the last point I want to touch on is franchise fees. Franchise fees are a rate that is added to a power bill and a natural gas bill. So Fortis, Echo, they collect these fees for the town as part of their franchise agreement to have their distribution through the municipality. The maximum franchise fee that can be charged for electrical is 20% and 35% for natural gas, as regulated by the Alberta Utilities Commission. So I'll get into the rates on the next slide, but just for consideration, Council does have the ability to increase these rates should they need to. A 1% increase in a franchise fee for electricity, probably get $42,000 extra revenue a year. It's about $8.78 per household per year. If we're looking at gas, 1% is about a $20,000 increase for municipal revenue, and about a $6 increase per year per household. So the way these franchise fees are calculated, it's actually based on the DET charges, so distribution and transmission, that's on your bill, based on a percentage. So it's not like if you have a fixed rate versus a variable rate, you're going to pay more or less. Everybody essentially pays the same because it's on distribution and transmission, which is a same rate for everybody across the board. So let's look at the rates here. How do we compare? So on the going left to right here, so left is our electricity franchise fee. In yellow, you're going to see Coaldale is at 13%. Again, the maximum of this is 20%. So you've got BYLAWS, Morinville, for example, at the max of 20. Tabor is at 18. Lethbridge at 16. Olds 15. We are below average for our municipal counterparts. What does an average resident pay per year? On electrical franchise fees, they pay $114 to the town of Coaldale. Looking at the data here, again, this is lower than the majority of our counterparts here. Same thing for natural gas. Coaldale is at 15%. The max is 35, which you will see Blackfalds is at 35. You'll see Olds is at 30. Lethbridge at 27. Tabor's at 18. So every municipality listed here is higher for the natural gas franchise fee than Town Coalville. So the average yearly cost a resident pays for natural gas franchise to the town would be $96. So let's look at these combined. Average resident, again, paying about $210 a year in franchise fees to the town. Versus City of Lethbridge at $309, Blackfalds, who we do compare ourselves a lot to, at $400. That's essentially the max there. So when we're looking at our municipal budgets, budget deficits, their council does have property tax to look at, but again, franchise fees is more of a user pay kind of system. When you look at the average power bill for a household versus a commercial business, it's going to be higher for a commercial business than a resident. So this is a way to shift some more pressure to your business community because they use more power, they use more gas than your residents do, based on the ultimate tax strategy we want to achieve.
So Kyle, if the franchise fees, if we were to consider something like that and we were to say yes to it, how soon would that take effect? And is that immediate, or you have to give notice? Or?
Yeah, so there's a process which we do have to advertise for a couple of weeks. We do have to send information to the Utilities Commission for approval. As far as this budget process, we wouldn't be able to have something approved for January 1st, but March, beginning of March is the earliest we could do it. So to have something approved January 1st, the wheels have to start basically in September. So when we make a decision on budget, council wants to consider this. It's very easy to do a stopgap for a couple months and then have that effective March for going forward. This is just taking the data from before and just presenting it into more of a visual format. If you're a visual learner, so where's the average, right? $278. Coalville is at $210. Again, compared to the high-end Blackfalds at $400, which is essentially your max. So we're about half the max right now for Town Coalville. So there's those three revenue streams that we talked about, and what does that look together? So, excuse me, I took a $300,000 property. Just kind of pulled that out of a hat. And so what's the property taxes? What's the utility bill? What's the franchise fee? What's the yearly cost, right? So you can see the average yearly cost would be $4,837. This is slightly above the average of about, what's that, $80. The reason for that is because we do have generally more of we have the rec levy, and our residential tax rate is higher on average compared to that of our non-res. So this is just to give council kind of a picture of, you don't have to consider taxes only. You do have to consider utilities. You do have to consider franchise fees. What does this look total for a resident? So this is just kind of paints that picture for council, so they have that information when we're making these decisions. So again, a little more visual chart. We're just kind of above the average here on that. Pause for any questions. See no hands, I will continue. So section 3 here, so this is a financial overview. So these are revenue sources and areas of financing that the town does have available. So debenture debt, grants, and our municipal reserves. So I'll kind of summarize this text here for you. Debenture debt is essentially loans that we take out when we need to fund capital projects. For example, talking about the lagoon, we took a $4 million debenture debt out last year for 10 years. The interest rate on that loan was 3.08%. That loan is locked in at that interest rate for the term of the loan. So 10 years, we're paying 3.08, which considering now interest rates are over 5%. So you can kind of get in at the good time. It's going to pay long-term benefits. When we're looking at debt, there are levels of debt we can borrow from. The MGA does say you can only borrow up to about 1.5 times your annual revenue. I'll break this out in the chart here. If you can see this, I know this is kind of small, but this is a screenshot from the Treasury Board. And this is a kind of the historical, not historical, but where interest rates have moved. So you can see over the past year, if I look at a 10-year loan, a year ago it was at 2.87. We've gone up 2 points, so now we're at 4.78%. So interest rates have gone up. That does mean if we do have to borrow, there is additional financing cost. The good part is we got in good for our rec center. That was at 2.6. We got Green Lagoon at just over 3%. So having information and having kind of a long-term budget plan laid out for a long-term capital budget does somewhat give us opportunity to monitor these rates and kind of jump when we do see decreases in rates to kind of get the best deal for Coaldale. So this slide is kind of one we added last year too. It talks about what debt do we have on the books right now. So at the end of the year, we're going to be about $17.7 million total that we have in debt for funding projects. The chart does show the year we got each debt, when it should be repaid, the interest rate we're paying, and the annual payment. So if we look at the highest one now, we've got the stormwater trunk main, the Northeast Industrial Sanitary trunk main. Those are both taken out in 2002, paying 6.25%. Versus the lowest one on the board here is the multi-use recreation center at 2.69, $10 million. So that financing there is a fairly good bang for a buck. So this is what we have on the books. So just kind of an FYI for council. When we're looking at our current debt levels and our debt and our allowable debt, so the numbers, the smaller numbers on the right there, sorry, on the left, that's our current debt, that level we're projecting to be at from the end of this year to the end of 2025. This does assume no new debt. So right now we're at 17.7. In 3 years, we do project to be about $14.5 million. So that is a decrease as we're paying that off. The higher number there on the right is our debt ceiling. So this is essentially the most we're allowed to borrow under the MGA. So right now we've got about $11 million in available debt. When we look at 2025, we do expect to see that jump out to about $16 million. So this chart is just kind of summarizing this data from before. So how much debt have we utilized that we're allowed to? And I say debt because it's a good financing tool. Right now, we've utilized about 62% of our capacity. 3 years down the road, assuming no new debt, we're going to be at about 47% capacity. So that just shows, again, we're repaying the debt, but we also do expect a slight increase in our ceiling as well. Kind of a useful tool when we're looking at, again, long-term budgeting and how to fund some of these major capital expenditures that we may see over the next couple of years. Grant funding. So this is to kind of touch base on our allocated funding that the town does get every year. This is essentially locked-in grants. So there's two of them. The first is current MSI funding. In a couple of years, this will be replaced. Some of you may have heard the LGFF already, Local Government Fiscal Framework. So this funding is going to be tied to future provincial revenues. As provincial revenues go up, for every dollar they go up, this funding should go up by 50 cents. So right now, currently we're getting $867,000 in grant funding yearly for the MSI program. When we're looking at the LGFF, they're still negotiating how this funding is going to be split out. So there's still some uncertainty as to how much revenue the town will be getting in future years. For our budgets, we were a little conservative and assumed a slight decrease. So we went down to $850,000 for our budgets. But again, if funding does go up or they change the funding formula that's more beneficial to Coaldale, this number could go up, but it also could go down. So 850 right now is kind of our best guess until we know a little more. That's all we can do right now is guess where it's going to be. We're looking at the Canada Community Building Fund. So this used to be the gas tax fund. Annual grant funding from this is $520,000 a year. This program does expire in 2025. I've talked to a few people at municipal affairs who do expect that this program will be renewed, but they can never guarantee. So 2025, there is the slight possibility of some uncertainty associated with this funding. This is at the federal level, though, so any change in this would affect nationwide, not just Alberta. Other grants, Cam kind of touched base on this last night, did this grant presentation to council. We do apply for other grants as they're available to come up, project dependent. So I won't discuss any more on that, but those are the two, this MSI and the Canada Community Building Fund, those are the two main streams that we consider when we're doing our capital budget. Third point here, municipal reserve. So if you're not sure of what municipal reserves, if the wording kind of throws you off, just think of it as our savings account. So we're taking tax dollars every year and we're allocating them to future programs every year. We're putting in our savings account so we can save up for a large capital item or to fund one-time items. So with infrastructure costs, construction costs increasing, we do have some uncertainty with some of the grants, as we mentioned. It's important, there's always pressure on municipal revenues and taxes to find that good balance, but we also do have to consider it's important to increase our reserves and increase the amount of money we're putting away into the bank every year for future savings. So we can kind of fund these longer term capital projects. So when we come up 5 years from now, we're not saying, oh crap, we don't have the cash for this. If we've got a good financial plan, we can kind of slowly build up those funds over time and kind of have the savings account to pay for some of these projects down the road. Ways that we can increase reserves, we can reduce our operating budget. So you can keep taxes the same, but if you spend less on your day-to-day expenses, you've got more money you can plop right into the savings. No different at home as if you wanted to save for a vacation, you may not eat out. You may reduce some of your entertainment expenses and save more money for the future. And the second option, which isn't as popular, is to increase revenue. Taxes, utilities are the sources to increase the money we're saving for future expenditures. So before I get to this slide here, we haven't proposed any increases to utility rates or other service enhancement projects that would be included in these numbers. So we're looking at reserves. These are funds, again, that we're putting away for savings for future expenses. I try to break this out a little clearer than I have in the past here. So at the top, we're going to break it through utilities. So right now we put 1.45 million scheduled for next year away for our utility projects. So water projects, storm projects, waste collection, and storm. You may ask why we're putting money away for waste collection when that is a contracted services. But eventually those bins do have to get replaced. And when you have a large number of residents in Coaldale, at bins that are $100, $125 a piece, if they need to be replaced in 10 years, we do have to put money away to pay for those eventually. Second part here is our fleet and heavy equipment. So we've broken it out basically by department, yearly amounts that we should contribute to maintain our current fleet and replacement of equipment. That's $479,000 a year, increasing for inflationary factors. Finally, buildings, facilities, and others. These amounts obviously would not cover replacement of a pool, an arena, a curling rink, a community center. The funding isn't necessarily designed to cover future replacement, but to cover larger expenses that may come up, like such as fixing lights or fixing an HVAC, or other smaller, larger repairs to a building that do come up. The last one there, you will see an internal loan. So in 2017, when we did buy that land in the Northwest, we did pay down some debt, and we did take an internal loan to pay some of the debt and to fund part of that land. So we've essentially borrowed from ourselves, and as part of borrowing from ourselves, we do have to pay that back. So we have an internal loan on the books of about $1.8 million. That this $90,000 gets allocated to every year to reduce that. If that internal loan does get repaid sooner, say if that was paid down tomorrow, council doesn't have an extra $90,000 that they can allocate to a particular project, should they wish. So again, without any tax increases or utility increases, right now we're at about just under $2 million a year we're putting into reserves, which I believe 3-4 years ago we were more at the 1.5 million. So you can see it's been a focus on, as part of the budget process, as to if we're saving money, let's not just spend the money because we have it. Let's put it into reserves so we have more for future capital expenses. Any questions on anything we've discussed so far before we get to the next part?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so we're going to get into a little more of the nuts and bolts here. So for the operating budget, today we've broken it up into two sections. What are the needs to maintain existing service levels within the town, and what are enhancements for future services and whatnot. We're only going to talk about to maintain the existing service levels today. Future enhancements and requests will be presented at a subsequent meeting. So here is kind of your table of contents for the main items that we're just going to discuss with council. These are items that will change, and due to inflationary pressures that we need additional funding to essentially keep up for. Again, these are essentially to maintain existing service levels within the town. So this is kind of a small, it might be hard to see this, but this spreadsheet essentially takes all of these items here and breaks down what the actual change to the budget is. So if we're looking at revenues, let's look at the very top left section in the blue, assessment growth. We're projecting $210,000 in increased revenue. So total with other sources, increased revenue of $365,000 for this next year. We just keep going down in the blue, total expenses that we're expecting to increase, so it's $725,000. We'll get to those here. But it shows right now, based on this very draft preliminary budget, we're at a funding deficit of $360,000, which is the equivalent of 3.87%. We've kind of done our best to project that over the next 3 years as part of this budget. That number is more heavy this year, obviously due to some certain pressures, which we'll discuss. On average over 3 years, it's about 2.4%. Just kind of a couple notes here. This doesn't, again, this is to maintain service level, so it doesn't include any increases to level of staffing for enhancements. And some of these are our best guess estimates. So they could change, but we're fairly confident that we've got a good handle on some of these estimates. This chart just if you want to kind of get an understanding or a better idea of which areas in town cost the most, this is a good chart. So on the left-hand side, we have each department that we do budget by, and the expenses, again, the total department expenses each department has, and any offsetting revenue that they do produce. So I'm just going to pick on the largest one here. You see number 2100, police has a yearly expense of 2.17 million. There are revenues of 420,000 for a net tax request of 1.75 million.
Where does the revenue come from on the police side?
There's 370,000 in grants that the province provides us, and $50,000 for highway traffic fines that we estimate. So when we talk about that, we talked last night about fines and follow radar. The total amount we do budget for fines and follow radar is $500,000 each year. About 50,000 we contribute to the RCMP and 450 to the follow radar. Kind of a note here on the utilities. So in the middle, so 34 is water, 3410 is water, and 3440 is storm. So you got those 4 revenue streams. If you look at the net, that's actually a positive number. So what that means is our utility revenue slightly subsidizes our tax. That's about $400,000 that there's that slight subsidy. This number was about $800,000  4 years ago. We're slowly trying to get that down to zero, which means that everything we collect for utilities goes back to utilities. So we're getting there. We're making good progress, but again, utilities does have a slight subsidy for tax, which isn't uncommon for small municipalities. That's don't think we're special in that standpoint. Any questions on any department numbers here or anything? I can provide any context if anybody's lost or anything, or are we still all good?
So on bylaw, you have 470,000 revenues. What does that come from?
So 450 of that is for the radar. There's other amounts for miscellaneous tickets that our CPOs give out as well. So you can see the folder radar fund essentially funds our bylaw department for the large part. It also does fund our safety grant of $35,000 a year, and it also does fund our community grants that we give out in May of $35,000 a year. So there's also a lot of times in the news discussions for the radar cash cow. Totally understand it. From our purposes, we use that money and invest it back into bylaw to provide that service to the community. So this is kind of more for information for the people at home and for council here. There's a lot of numbers floating around, like what's our actual budget? Like what's it made up, right? We talked about the different departments here. But let's kind of break that down into more specific line items. So start on the left and kind of work our way down and to the right. We start at taxes, right? So total taxes we collect. This does include our amount we collect for the province, and we pay them for education. It's just under 13 million. Again, about 3.5 million of that isn't the towns, that goes to other sources. Next item there is essentially our utilities and other small fees. So utilities and other small department sales, rentals, leases, programming, user fees, so revenue from the hockey rink, from the pool, from the curling rink, and utility fees. So essentially user paid fees, that's just under 6 million, so 5.9. And then some other licenses, permits, development fees, tax certificates. How much do we budget for interest and penalties? Again, highway traffic fines, $500,000 there. How much do we budget for interest on our investments? How much do we budget for franchise fees? You can see those numbers on the right there. so on and so forth. So this one was the revenue side. This is looking at the expenses. So this is, again, is organizational wide. Again, starting left, going down and moving to the right. We do have utility or wages and salaries total. Part of this budget is $6.7 million. Contracted services. So this is broken down for council. So like advertising, printing, postage, training, professional fees, cleaning, building repairs, other contracted services, department expenses, 5.6 million. That department expense you see for 2 million, that's largely our contracted RCMP. So again, that is the single biggest item the town does have in our budget. Materials, supplies, goods, utilities on the right hand side. So again, breaking that out further, so you just kind of have an understanding of what do we spend in a year on these items, right? So fuel and oil, $147,000 a year we spend. Our power bill, right, $745,000 a year. So it kind of gives you a good understanding of how the funding is allocated. Bank charges, interest on long-term debt, how much debt are we repaying every year? Our annual interest on our debt is $450,000, while we're paying just under $1 million in principal every year. So we're paying about $1.4 million in debt a year. And again, the bottom net number is just the unfunded amount right now. This is just kind of breaking it down by our different departments. So how each department is kind of allocated for expenses. So you can see the majority of our expenses are from the operations department. So that includes things such as our common services, our fleet, our roads, our water, sewer, garbage, utilities. So essentially maintaining the roads, the utilities, that's the biggest department budget item of expenses of $7.8 million, or 35% of our total budget. I've got to break it down to the other departments here. I won't explain them, but this is on the revenue side. So where does the majority of our revenue come from? That general one is essentially taxes and franchise fees. Operations is utilities, protective services, so these would be grants we receive, our partnerships with Lethbridge County for fire services, photo radar, whatnot, recreation and culture. So again, these are basically user pay fees. So like at the arena, the pool, curling, whatnot. There's kind of a lot of data and a lot of numbers here that I went through fast, but was there anything you want further detail on or questions? No?
Any questions for Kyle?
Okay.
You're doing an excellent job presenting. So
So the last kind of section of this presentation, we're going to break out these items specifically as to kind of why they increased and why we're requesting additional funding to fund these items. So wages and salaries. So this is largely tied to our collective agreements that we do negotiate with our union counterparts that negotiated COLA, cost of living, 1.5% for 2023, 2024. That same amount negotiated under the collective agreement does go to those employees not in the collective agreement. Some employees are also receiving step movement, so basically years of service. If they've earned another year of service, so based on their agreement that they have, based on their employment, they may be eligible for another bump based on that. And then part of that was from Council's change to the council remuneration policy from the September meeting. RCMP officer cost. So a year ago-ish, almost, not maybe quite a year, they were finalizing their collective agreements with the federal government, in which the federal government negotiated entirely with the RCMP without any feedback or consultation from stakeholders and municipalities who ultimately pay the bill. So they negotiate and say, this is how much it's going to be. Municipalities, please pay. When we did the budget last year, we thought we kind of had a rough estimate of how much that was going up. Those numbers were finalized after we approved the budget last year. We got the actual numbers in March, and they were a little higher than we anticipated. So our CMP costs are going up. One note on the budget is we currently have 9 established positions in Coaldale. When the RCMP does provide us how much we should be budgeting for and anticipating for, they do only project an estimated 8 positions each year that will be utilized. This is adjusted for when people go on special leaves, maternity or medical leave. So historically, we've been about 7.5 to 8.5 positions each year based on our actual utilization. So this is essentially telling council that we have 9 established positions. We only budget for 8 based on what the RCP projects we're actually going to utilize. So if they have 100% full utilization, there could be a deficit here. If they don't, there could be a surplus here. So this is how the RCMP budget can kind of change based on our actual projections. So looking at historical costs here, so this is a per officer cost at 100%. Again, not to point out for the 22,000th time, Coaldale pays 100% and not 70% like every other municipality in Canada. This per officer cost isn't the actual per cost of just one body. It's where the RCMP allocates all their equipment, so their guns, vehicles, overhead from their national department. They allocate that on a per officer basis. So what does that per officer cost? In 2020, we were at $164,000. For 2023 here, we're going to be at $230,000. So this line item we're discussing now does not relate to any increase enhancements or new officers. This is just purely an increase based on their collective agreement with the federal government that was negotiated, that they in turn come back to us and say, you must pay. So to kind of give an understanding of how these costs are increasing, in 2020, again, same visual format here, $164,000, and in 2015, we're going to be at $219,000 on estimate. So what is the RCMP budget? Never mind. I don't have that slide. So this kind of shows how the costs are increasing. So when we're looking at back here, when I say our RCMP inflationary cost is $275,000 for the next year, that is why that cost is going up based on these per officer numbers here.
And our current contract expires 2032.
I believe so, yes.
And just for clarity, Kyle, the reason that the cost increase is most pronounced in 2023 is because you're likely comparing the per officer cost from 21, given that we didn't get the established rate for 22 until after the budget was approved. And so that's why the jumps from 22 to 3-year high, but then from 23 to 24, a bit more reasonable.
Yeah, we had projected that cost to go up to about $177,000 last year. You'll see our numbers were low. It wasn't 177, it was 195. So that's why that increase is so much larger this year. And part of the reason too, that from our discussions last night, we were projecting a slight deficit from our RCMP costs this year. Next, so let's talk about utilities. So electricity, natural gas, and water. So currently the town does have a fixed electricity rate that does run until 2024. That's currently about 5.9 kilowatts per hour. So we are fixed at that at a fairly reasonable rate compared to current markets. What we are doing though is with our utilities consultants, they said that there's some good value to look at locking in for longer term. So with our contract expiring in 2 years, we're actually in the market right now. So we're about to tender to lock in that electricity price from 2025 to 2027. So when you do look at that graph I have, you'll see there is a larger bump for 2025. That's because we are expecting our electricity rate to go from 5.9 kilowatts to maybe 8 kilowatts. That's kind of what we're projecting at this time. Again, and electricity will go up based on some of the recent construction. So we do have the new Civic Square, we do have the Lagoon Station. Those are two large facilities that will have increased demand for power consumption. Natural gas, this contract unfortunately is expiring this year. We're currently in the market right now for looking for a provider and through the RFP process for a new contract January 1st, 2023 to 2027. So we're expecting, currently we're at a mix of a fixed and a variable rate at 2.3 gigajoules. We're expecting that to rise to 5.5 gigajoules. So that's why the natural gas is going from $100,000 a year to about $166,000 a year. Again, partly because we do have new construction and a bigger footprint that we have to heat. Water consumption. When we look at this, we kind of look at how much water we spent the last years and use that as our budget baseline. Last couple summers have been longer, hotter, drier. We spent more money on water at our parks, our recreation facilities, and the tot law is notoriously inefficient for water usage, right? As they go and play on the spray parks, the cannons, the water comes out, goes down the drain, doesn't get recirculated, doesn't get reused. So water alone, the tot law is $30,000 a year compared to the pool when it's $7,000 a year. So that is a possible item that we've mentioned to our rec department to look at maybe some type of a circulation system to save on that operating cost as well. That's kind of one of the big items there. So I never would have expected the tot lot to use that much more water than the pool, but it is probably about 4 to 5 times as much as the pool. Okay, so break the figures out in a table for you. So left to right, what was our budget this year? What are we projecting the next couple of years? Total utilities $850,000, projecting the bump to $1.03 million. And again, another larger bump in 2025 when that electricity contract does get renewed. We are expecting a jump in fees there. Again, more for the visual learners. As you can see, the rates increasing here. Insurance, this is also another item that as we do build more, this item does go up. And the insurance market has seen a high level of price escalations and cost escalations. Budget last year was $190,000. We're thinking we're going to be more, about $220,000 in the next year here. With new builds, as property values go up and purely cost to, our buildings are based on replacement costs. So the building 4 years ago was a lot cheaper to replace than the building is now. So that does happen. As construction prices go up, our insurance also does go up as well. Excuse me, fuel expense. So everybody here is paying more to gas up their car or their truck. Town of Cola is no different. $120,000 a year was our budget last year, projecting that to go up to $147,000, with slight increases year over year as inflation keeps rising. Sidewalk replacement program and snow removal. This was some creativity from our operations department. About before we had 10 grand a year allocated to our sidewalk maintenance program, which is low considering the level of sidewalks and the age of the sidewalks in the town. They looked at increasing this to $35,000 a year, so an increase in bump in $25K. But again, kind of knowing that budgets are definitely more difficult this year, it was suggested that we can kind of decrease our snow removal from $100,000 to $75,000 to kind of make that a cost neutral move. There's kind of an asterisk here that this decrease in snow removal is based on kind of historical use over the past couple of years, and nobody can predict the weather and how much it's going to snow. So while this is kind of what we spent and predict over the next couple of years, there could be some uncertainty with this number. We do have some cash stashed away in a snow removal reserve. So if we do have a big snowfall and we do need additional services, we do have reserves that could fund that as well. But this is kind of again, a increase in services, but kind of a cost neutral move to be cognizant of the pressures that the town is facing on the budget wise, while increasing our sidewalk enhancement program. Shared washers at the campground. So there was an agreement between the town of Colio and the Owl's Nest campground. So this basically allows users of the mountain bike park to use their washrooms at the campground. So the town doesn't have to build and invest and maintain that facilities. This new cost is $12,000 a year to maintain that agreement as well. Inflationary adjustments. So when we do the budget, it's not uncommon for some municipalities to take a 2% or 3% increase for each line and just add that to their budgets. We like to kind of steer away from that because that can essentially create fat in your budget if you're just increasing it 2%, 3% every year for no rhyme or reason. What we do for the budget is we look at each line item by department, line by line, looking at what we're actually spending and do we project these costs to increase or decrease. So we've been able to essentially hold steady on the majority of our contracted services and our supplies and materials for this next year. But there could be some challenges, again, with inflation not slowing down. We're presenting this to council, so there's not essentially surprises in future years. So for 2024 and 2025, and this is just kind of a rough guess. So we're not coming back to council next year and be like, wow, man, costs are going up so much. We're going to need inflation. We're suffering here. This kind of builds a buffer into the budget that can be as a placeholder for future years, but can be evaluated as part of next year's budget. But again, to reduce some surprises from future inflationary pressures. So it's a $50,000 increase year over year for 24 and 25. Again, this isn't additional money for this year as we've gone through the line by line items, but we're just being aware of what could happen in future years, and again, reducing surprises as well. The last item here I'm going to touch base on is our debenture debt. So this relates to the schedule from before. As we do pay off debt, that does create a surplus in the operating budget. So at the end of this year, the 12th and 15th Street Road repavement program from 2007 will be fully repaid. That's $21,000 in additional funding for the budget. Looking at future years, the loader and the hydrovac will be fully repaid off next year, the grader in 24, and the lift truck in 25. So those numbers that you see there will give you budget surpluses once that debt is paid off. So just working back to this slide again, just a summary of all the data that we've kind of went over, we've discussed with council. So kind of just rip the bandage off here. Largely due again to increases in our policing costs, in our utilities. Right now the budget is and a 3.87% increase to maintain service levels. Property values will go up next year as well. Inflation hit them fairly hard, not hard, but inflation did increase the values. It's always good when property values do go up. So I bring that up for the purpose of discussion, in that while taxes will go up, there will be tax increases required to fund this. You expect the mill rate to go down. How that mill rate is changed based on the residents and the non-residential will be further discussions that we're going to have with council as part of what we want for tax strategy. What do we want that ratio at? And how much, do we want to increase franchise fees rather than property taxes? When I say we're looking at this number and it's a tax increase, that doesn't mean you just have to look at taxes. You can look at franchise fees as another source of revenue. You can look at the tax ratio. Do we want to put more pressure, not more pressure, but reduce the amount of pressure on our residents, which is already high compared to others versus the non-residential properties. One slide I didn't have to put in here is, I know this number does look big, and it shouldn't be something that is taken lightly. But Colliel isn't special in this regard for a budget process or budget numbers. I've had several municipalities reach out to me asking what our budget number is looking at, and this is the first year that has ever happened. Many municipalities are looking at increases between 4 and 6% to maintain service levels as well. I'm not sure if you read in the news, City Lethbridge was 37.7 year over year for 3 years. We're at 2.4 over 3 years. City of Calgary, I believe, is at 5% for the next 3 years. I've heard Canmore right now is 10% for next year. And speaking with our property assessor, they work for majority of the communities in Southern Alberta. Essentially, everybody else is kind of in the same boat and facing the same pressures. So this isn't a Colliel only program. This is an economy problem that we're facing with inflationary charges. So it's, again, not Colliel specific. It is something we do have to evaluate and see how we want to adjust. But again, we're not the only community facing these pressures. Just to summarize, so this was all I have to present for this meeting. I'll open it up for questions after. The next meeting is scheduled for November 22nd, which we're going to present and discuss with Council new budget enhancement requests. So areas that new requests from staff for different projects, areas that could increase service levels, and we will be going over the capital budget list as well. So with that, I will send this over to Council after this meeting. This is an Excel. What you see on here is an Excel document. And in the revenue in the Excel side, you're going to see on the right side it says Other. If you want to go in there and make your own assumptions or changes or numbers, if you want to put, what if we knock item A down 50 grand or increase 50 grand, this will change the percentage it calculates, so you can kind of play SimCity in your free time and give you something to think about over the next week. With that being said, any questions? That's all I have today.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle. I'll open it up to council. Are there any questions? Councilor Beekman.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for the presentation. Those quite easy to understand there. Notice I was never a part of this, but I'm curious to know why there's no rec levy on commercial property tax. I understand commercial businesses the commercial business maybe won't, or the purpose of the rec levy doesn't necessarily apply to the commercial business, but why wouldn't we apply that levy across the board?
Do you remember that answer? There was a reason for it. I don't remember it off the top of my head though.
Like under the new Municipal Government Act, under the special tax section, they're very specific on the criteria that goes along with any type of special tax that get added to the tax bills. And it was council preference, but I also believe, and I'll have to just verify this, but my understanding is that it wasn't eligible for a recreation tax because there is no direct benefit for the non-residential properties.
Okay.
And you have to be able to demonstrate a benefit for the person paying the special tax. So we had a legal opinion. They developed the bylaw in accordance with the criteria of the MGA, and I'm happy to dig that up and send it out just as an FYI, but it was a fairly detailed exercise that we went through to make sure we were within the legislative boundaries of these changes to the Municipal Government Act.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Councilor Avery, thank you, Mayor.
So we keep talking percent. Is it percent 1 mill rate?
Is a percent 1 mill rate? I would say percent as in if you're percent of what you're currently paying right now for property taxes. So if you're paying $1,000, 3.87% is $38.70. It's not necessarily 1 mill rate, because when we're going to look at the mill rates, and that if we're going to take the average inflation, right? So if on average properties in town go up by 8% just based on inflation, so your property was worth $100,000 last year, and now it's $108,000. If you keep your mill rate the same, that resident is paying more tax. So when we go to this, our projected tax increase is going to be lower than our assessment, than our inflation base. So the mill rate, if we look at that, is actually probably going to go down. So it's hard to say is a percentage of mill rate, because it's tied to another factor that we have to kind of consider. So it's just a percentage of kind of what you're paying now, right? What is a resident paying now? What is a business paying now?
Right. So there is a possibility of a 0% increase if property assessment goes up 4%.
In the mill rate, yes. So it's still a tax increase if somebody is paying more tax.
Right.
But for the mill rate to change or to go down, it's very likely that the mill rate is going to go down because the inflation is so much higher. Does that answer that?
Yep. And second question with the policing. So we've got this contract for the next 20 years. Can we reduce our policing on that contract, or do we have to? Because we always talk about increasing. Can we reduce our policing? Because they've given us an 18% increase in costs over the last 2 years, with no say from the people that are paying the bill. 100% of the bill, not a 70-30. So can we go back and say we want 6 officers, enhance our bylaw enforcement, our municipal enforcement, and pay for 6 officers? Now we're saving $420,000, and now we've made up our percentages and our mill rate, and we should be able to reduce the mill rate because of the inflation of what the police charges have cost us.
Whether that is allowed or how that process is be communicated or set in going forward, we're going to have to review that contract first before we provide an answer. So I don't know the answer without looking at the contract, but we can look at it and see what those steps would be and have an answer for you at the next budget meeting.
Okay, thank you. Franchise fees, my third question. If we raise those by 2% on each one, that would be an increase of approximately $132,000 in revenue. So now we're 1.3% that we'd be gaining again from that 3.8. So now we're down to 2%. Is that correct? If we did a franchise fee increase to align ourselves more in the middle of the other municipalities.
Yep. Yeah. So if you, I'm sure you have to calculate. So what did you say? 130, 120-ish? Yeah. So yeah, then you're down to about $230,000. So that gets you down to 2.4, 2.5% tax increase as well. On that note, kind of maybe some good news when we're looking at total tax bill, right? We have our municipal portion that you as council you oversee. We talked about the education portion. The province can increase or decrease that based on how they want. Our initial what we're hearing is that the province is coming back with a revenue neutral budget for next year on the education side. So initial thoughts, don't hold me to this, but initial thoughts is that the province is not going to be asking for any more education money than they currently have in their budget. So that means that if we reduce your municipal tax rate, it's likely at this point that residents won't as well see an increase in the education portion as well. So that when we're, again, we only have control over the municipal one, but for residents, they only care about what their total is. That does provide a little bit of, they're not getting double dinged almost. So we normally don't have great news from the province all the time in their finances, but that's maybe one silver lining in this process as well.
2 more questions.
Okay.
Utility rates.
Yeah.
So if we increased our utility rates on the lowest amount to 10, I believe it was, that would bring in another approximately 202,000 or 200 and some thousand. I know that's not the preferred method, but would that be something we should and could look at?
So part of the next capital budget, there's a couple projects, we've discussed it before, Malloy, right? The water reservoir, and there's some water issues that have been discussed and talked about before. Those larger capital projects are going to need additional funding to support and whatnot. We've kind of drafted up some proposed utility rate increases to fund those projects. So I wouldn't necessarily it wouldn't be my recommendation to increase utility rates to fund this. I would gear those rate increases more towards those specific project ones. And that does help provide relief on the tax basis too, because if you're using proper longer term funding and analysis of your utility rates to pay and fund these projects, we don't have to dig into MSI. We don't have to dig into our gas tax or Canada Community Building Fund to supplement these utility expenses. Those grants can go back for other programs and other facilities in town to fund those and reduce future tax pressure. So it does provide an indirect benefit, but not a direct benefit as far as reducing this total.
One last, if we decrease the amount we're putting in the savings account by a couple percent, that would give us another percent, correct? So if we reduced it a little bit, each one of those line items, or might give it back to you guys, we just said we want to reduce. That's another way of looking at it, like less than the piggy bank over the next 3 years.
That would reduce the amount required for taxes. From my viewpoint, when we're seeing prices escalate, we're seeing costs escalate, it's not something I would recommend, because while it does fix an answer now, it kind of escalates the problem 3 years from now, when you have to get, rather than slowly increasing those to a more at a lower level now, if you decrease them a little bit, in 3 years you might have to have a larger bump that's going to have to get back to areas that you need. So when, for example, we're looking at our fleet replacement, we could reduce those now, but that's going to put higher pressure down the road. So yes, could you do that to reduce your taxes? Totally. My recommendation, though, is you as council can decide what you want, but I would not recommend that approach.
Okay, good. Any further questions?
And another one for
Councilor Beauchamp.
Thank you. Going to page 57 in the PowerPoint, just around sidewalk replacement. Maybe this will be covered at the next meeting, but I'm just curious to know whether, if you look at that as a percentage-wise, I mean, we're 3.5 times increase on that. Is there a reason for that? Or like, why such a large increase?
Sure. I will have Justin here provide some comments on that.
Thank you.
Evening, Council. So the sidewalk maintenance program, that's something that's been pretty underfunded for the last 10 years. It's one of our highest complaint areas. I would say, other than when it snows, we get sidewalk calls each week of residents have concerns about cracking sidewalks, broken sidewalks. So this is just to bump that up, probably where it should have been the whole time.
Okay.
It's drastically underfunded. So.
Okay. And going with the 35,000 a year, we'll max that out every year then?
You're going to use all that budget, right?
We'll
That's
use
fine.
it.
That'll go to contracted services, and that budget will be used with support of our internal services. That's how our sidewalk program works. We do some of the work, but most of it is contracted services. So,
Okay, thank you.
And to that, just to add on to that, when we're looking at asset management and sidewalks has fall into that. Again, nobody likes a tax increase. We all pay taxes here, and it all sticks. But there's, we see it. There's areas in town that haven't received as much attention and funding as they maybe should. Sidewalks and roads are big ones that come to mind. They're only going to get worse, and the cost to, if you just focus on as council fixing little bits every year, rather than big chunks here and big chunks there, that's going to save costs long term because you're slowly fixing a little bit over time. You're not kind of building a deficit. So this is a good example of, again, it's $25,000, but this kind of increase slowly to the program is going to pay much longer term dividends for this program. Rather than having to replace half the sidewalks in 10 years because they're all shot, we will have a good inventory going forward.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Kyle? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if I could get someone to sponsor a motion that council receive the budget deliberation report as information. Councilor Saylor, any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. I'll just ask our CAO if there's anything else that we need to adjourn.
We're good to adjourn, Mr. Mayor. The next meeting would be November 22nd, and the meeting after that, we will be substituting the previously planned date of November 29th and commencing. The intent is to commence, or we'd schedule the 29th meeting to December 5th, ideally starting at 4 p.m.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. If that's everything, then let's need a motion to adjourn, please. Councilor Reese, all those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much.